Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another edition of Budget Magic. So this week, we have a really sweet, super spicy, incredibly cheap deck for Kaladesh Standard, and this deck has been super good. I've been actually crushing it with this list this week. It is really powerful, really unique. I really like this deck. This is White-Black Fabricate, and that name's a little bit deceiving, because it's kind of two different decks in one. On one hand, it's a white-black token strategy that can go wide and kill the opponent. On the other hand, it's kind of white-black aristocrats that can deal all this damage, drain the opponent out without even dealing any combat damage. So this started from a list that went 5-0 in a Magic Online League in the hands of I Have the Fire. So this is inspired by that list, but it's a decent amount different. I changed some cards up to my liking, hopefully to improve the deck. I also really focus on getting it super cheap. We've had a lot of $80, $90 decks recently. I wanted to have an ultra budget deck, which we define as $50. Whenever we do the articles for Budget Magic, I try to post a $50 ultra budget list as a starting point. Well, this deck is ultra budget in its current form, so the list we're playing in the videos is already ultra budget, so I wanted to have a really cheap option out there for Kaladesh Standard. Anyway, a quick reminder before we break down the deck: if you enjoy Budget Magic and this is a White-Black Fabricate deck, it would be awesome of you if you could take a minute, click that subscribe button down in the corner of your screen. It's a great way to support the channel and the site for free. So let's talk about this deck. So basically, we're built around the Fabricate mechanic, as you can see on cards like Angel of Invention and Weaponcraft Enthusiast. So Fabricate is this interesting mechanic. Each Fabricate card has a number. For Angel of Invention and Weaponcraft Enthusiast, they have Fabricate 2, and that means when they enter the battlefield, we get to choose one of two options. Either we put that many +1/+1 counters on our creature, so Angel of Invention can be a 4/3 Flying Lifelink Vigilance, or when it enters the battlefield, we can choose to make two 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature tokens. So Angel of Invention can also be a 2/1 Flying Vigilance lifelink that comes along with two 1/1 artifact token friends, and it pumps them up because it has an ability that anthems all the rest of our creatures. Weaponcraft Enthusiast, kind of the same choice, not quite as powerful, but only 3 mana, can be a 2/3, or it can come along with two 1/1 servos. So with this deck, 9 times out of 10, I would say, we are making the tokens. That's kind of the plan of this deck, because making the servo token supports both of our goals. So sometimes with this deck, we win by being the token beatdown deck. We make a bunch of servos, we play multiple Angels of Invention to pump them up so they're 2/2s, 3/3s, and we just beat our opponent down by going wide. Other times, we play like an Aristocrats deck, where we're sacking our servo tokens to drain our opponent out, and making the servos is necessary for both of those choices. Of course, there's exceptions. If we play an Angel of Invention, and our opponent has a Liliana on the other side of the battlefield, a lot of times we're going to put the counters on it, because our opponent will just plus Liliana, kill the Angel. So there's exceptions, but most of the time we want to be making servo tokens, because that's kind of the plan of the deck. So as far as the aristocraty plan of the deck, this is enabled by 2 cards. We have Marionette Master, another Fabricate card, in Zulaport Cutthroat. So Marionette Master is the one Fabricate card where we really make both choices a lot. Sometimes we make the servos, and that gives us a 1/3 that whenever an artifact we controlled goes to the graveyard, drains our opponent for 1. And then sometimes, if we have a bunch of servos and artifacts on the battlefield already, we are going to put the counters on Marionette Master, which makes it a 4/6, and whenever an artifact goes to the graveyard, it drains our opponent for 4, which means we only need 5 artifacts to die to drain our opponent out from 20. So it really depends on what happened before in the game. If we play a bunch of Weaponcraft Enthusiasts, Angel of Inventions, and we already have a bunch of servos, a lot of times we just stick the counters on Marionette Master and try to drain our opponent out in big chunks. Other times, if we don't have much on the battlefield, we go wide, make some chunk blockers, drain a little bit. Zulaport Cutthroat gives us a secondary drain effect, so we can play this on turn 2. We get these servos out there. As the servos are dying, we don't only get to drain from Marionette Master, but also Zulaport Cutthroat. Plus, Cutthroat drains when other creatures die too, and unlike Marionette Master, it actually gains us life, which can be relevant. So go wide with servos. Sometimes we win by beating down, sometimes we win by having our servos die. And then we get to make a bunch of clue tokens as well. So this is one of the sweetest parts of the deck, is Marionette Master says whenever an artifact goes in your graveyard, it doesn't care what that artifact is. So with Thraben Inspector and Bygone Bishop, we not only get reasonable creatures, Bygone Bishop, a flying threat, Thraben Inspector, a good roadblock in the early game, but they make clues, and we can get a bunch of clues on the battlefield. Bygone Bishop can make a lot of clues sometimes when we cast all of our cheap creatures, and then we play our Marionette Master, and we can win the game just by sacking clues to draw cards, especially if we put the counters on Marionette Master, because each clue that we sack represents 4 life loss from our opponent, so we just play the Marionette Master, sack a bunch of clues the next turn, and our opponent gets drained out to 0. When we're not sacrificing clues, we have some creatures and other cards that allow us to sacrifice our stuff for value. So Eilee and Syndicate Trafficker are essentially 1 mana sacrifice outlets for our servo tokens. Eilee has the upside of being able to sack other creatures as well, which works with Zulaport Cutthroat. Syndicate Trafficker has the upside of just being a really hard to deal with threat. Becoming indestructible when we sack an artifact is actually really strong. It makes Syndicate Trafficker great on defense, and a lot of times we can attack and put our opponent in a position where they have to make a really bad block, and we can sack any artifact, just like with Marionette Master. So that's the other trick here, is we can use Syndicate Trafficker to sack our clue tokens for only 1 mana instead of 2, which facilitates the drain our opponent out with Marionette Master plan, makes it a little more mana efficient. Yes, we don't get to draw the cards, but it makes it a lot faster if we have a bunch of extra clues laying around. Vampiric Rites, just a one-of, kind of a backup sacrifice plan, can sack any creature, also helps us cycle through our deck a little bit. And then the big payoff, one of the most common ways we win the game is Westville Abbey. So we play all of our stuff. We make all these servos. On turn 6, we play Marionette Master. Then on turn 7, we untap. We have enough mana that we just sack 5 servo tokens to Westville Abbey, which, if we have our Marionette Master with the counters on it, is 20 damage on the spot. That's not even counting our Zulaport Cutthroat, our Angel of Invention pumping the Marionette Master. Plus, we get a huge attacking 9/7 with flying and lifelink. So Westville Abbey is our most common way of actually closing out the game, because it's a mass sack outlet that also leaves behind a huge creature, and occasionally we win like the old Aristocrats deck, where maybe sacking stuff doesn't quite get our opponent to 0, but if it gets our opponent down under 9, there's a good chance that Ormondal is just going to close out the game. As far as the rest of the main deck, we get a bit of removal. Grasp and Stasis Snare for creatures. Anguish Unmaking is a nice hedge. It gets creatures. Since we gain life from Eilee, from Zulaport Cutthroat, we don't really mind too much paying 3 life, and it can hit planeswalkers, artifacts, any non-land permanent, which makes it really relevant. There's not many cards that deal with planeswalkers, Smuggler's Copter, and Ulamog, for example, all in one card for an efficient price. In the mana base, really stripped back here. 4 Evolving Wilds, 4 Forsaken Sanctuaries, and a bunch of basic lands. This can obviously be improved by adding in more black-white duels, Shambling Vent, Concealed Courtyard. But like I said, we went ultra budget, trying to make this as cheap as possible. In the sideboard, we get a bunch of discard, and then we get a bunch more removal. Fragmentize, specifically for Smuggler's Copter, Fleetwheel, Cruisers, things like that. Lost Legacy helps against Eldrazi, other specific combo-esque decks. And then we have 1 Kembal, Council of Allocation, mostly for control matchups or somewhat stormy matchups. If our opponent's going to be playing a lot of egg-type cards like Prophetic Prism and Metal Spinner's Puzzle Knot, Kembal is really devastating against those decks, because we gain 2 and our opponent loses 2 life whenever they cast a non-creature. And then just a couple of Wrath-esque effects. Flaying Tendrils gets rid of a whole bunch of little things. Eliminate the Competition is actually another sack outlet, which is nice. So it's another, almost like Westville Abbey, 5 mana, sack any number of servos, really, and we can destroy a bunch of creatures along the way. So that is ultra budget white-black Fabricate for Kaladesh Standard, and this deck is super awesome. I have had a ton of success with it. You can make some easy upgrades, but the deck in its current form isn't that far away from being where I would play it, even without budget restraints. I think that As far as upgrading it, I would be looking at maybe some Gideons, improving the mana base, but the creatures and the spells, in the main deck especially, are pretty much where I would want to be, even if you said you can spend any amount of money on that deck. So that's one of the things I like about this deck is it's naturally cheap. It's not like we're really making horrible choices to make it ultra budget. It just happens to be that a lot of these cards are underplayed. They don't have that much demand at the moment. So we can get by making a $50 deck that can really compete in Standard for that reason. And like I said, you can always upgrade it with Avacyn's and Gideons and better lands and so forth. But the deck is super sweet. It's really fun to play. If you like Aristocrat strategies, if you like token strategies, if you like going wide, or even going tall, the deck does a little bit of everything, which makes the matches really fun. So I really like decks that play out differently every time, and this is one of them. So sometimes we're going on the beatdown plan, sometimes we're more of the control deck, sometimes we're a combo deck that's looking to just barely get our 5 creatures to sack them to Westville Abbey to drain our opponent out. So games play out very differently, and it seems to have the tools to compete across archetypes. We have enough early game creatures and good removal to fight aggro. We also are fairly resilient against control decks, especially after sideboarding. We can deal with planeswalkers, deal with creatures. The deck just has it all, so I'm really excited for this, especially for the price tag. Anyway, that's been our deck tech for White-Black Fabricate Ultra Budget in Kaladesh Standard. I hope you enjoyed the gameplay videos. Thank you very much for watching, and I will talk to you soon.